All right, everybody. So thank you for coming today. I just felt like there's so many cool things to talk about. Obviously, we could talk forever about Pesach and ideas that flow from it. But I figured let's take a pause from whatever we're doing and whatever we're stressing about, and take a moment to learn together. And unlike my usual shiurim, I have some specific ideas about what I want to talk about, but I also want us to be able to discuss some things and discuss some ideas. So I'm going to share my screen again. And can you all see this? Okay, great. Okay, so I've been thinking a lot recently. The reason I wanted to talk about this and kind of share these sources is I've been thinking a lot about the Korban Pesach and what kind of Korban it was, where it was sacrificed, what was unusual about it. And if we go back to our original ideas about the original Pesach, and I just want to start with this, but we're going to take a detour and then come back to it at the end. But I want to just start with some questions, and as you know, in true Pesach style, start with some questions and ideas that sort of conflict with each other. So we're told about the first Pesach. What do we consider the first Pesach? Obviously, the first Pesach was in Egypt, where you have this band of slaves that is told for the first time to come, and for the first time in their lifetime and the lifetime of their ancestors, is told to come together to worship God, to serve God, of some sort of avodah. And what is the essence of that avodat Hashem? It's called a avodat Pesach. It's called the rabbis call it as opposed to a Korban Dorot, which is the Pesach that was offered, the Korban Pesach that was offered in the first and second Beit HaMikdash and possibly in the Mishkan, but that's also up for question. This is called a Korban Mitzrayim. The rabbis call it the Korban Mitzrayim. It's the only Korban Mitzrayim. It's the only time the slaves in Egypt gave some sort of sacrifice to God as some sort of worship. That happened one time only. It's on the eve of their escape from Egypt. And yet, there's nothing about this Korban that has any relation to Korbanot that we heard of before and Korbanot that we heard of subsequently. So it's a highly unique moment in time. We know that Noach gave a Korban to God. We know that, by the way, if we go way back, right, Cain and Hevel tried out some Korbanot to God, right? We know that Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, they were Korbanot to God. Then we sort of have a slowing down of that. But Yaakov gives his famous Korban to God when he anoints the spot that the rabbis later say became the point of the Beit HaMikdash. So we have examples of Korbanot before a Mishkan, before a Beit HaMikdash. But what do all those Korbanot have in common? What do they all have in common? And how does that distinguish the Korban Mitzrayim, the one and only Korban given when the Jews were slaves? So what distinguishes it, if you think about it, they're all given on a Mizbeach. They're all given on an altar. In the case of the Mishkan, it's a Mizbeach that's part of the courtyard of the Mishkan. Later in the Beit HaMikdash, it's complicated where it is, but it's in the off of the Azara in both Beit HaMikdash and Batei Mikdash. So this is a one-time example where a Korban is actually sacrificed in a person's home. And what's unusual about the Korban Pesach Dorot, the Korban Pesach that then subsequently becomes part of our tradition in the Beit HaMikdash, and it's what, when we read the Haggadah and we read about Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Gamliel and perhaps a couple of others, I think Rabbi Yeshua, they actually, they're living at the time after the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, but their Seder is very unusual because it's the first time we hear about a Seder where there are, first of all, they're taking place outside of Yerushalayim, because the Korban Dorot of the second Beit HaMikdash always took place in Yerushalayim. The other thing that's unusual about their Seder is that many of the participants, Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus, many of those participants that we read about in the Haggadah actually remember and recall a Korban Pesach in the Beit HaMikdash. So they are really the bridge between us and what's happening in the second Beit HaMikdash, because they actually saw it happen. So when they're having this unusual Seder, this new fangled kind of celebration, and some people say that Rabbi Akiva's group is having it in secret. It's unclear exactly what their relationship is with the Romans at that moment and how secretive these Seders are, but they are recalling when they say, remember what happened to us. They're also at the same time recalling just a few years before what that Korban Pesach, what the Korban Dorot was like. So what's unusual about the Korban Pesach, the Korban Dorot after Egypt, once there was a Mishkan and a Beit HaMikdash, is that it seems from Masechet Pesachim that this was a Korban that while the initial parts of the sacrifice were actually given in the Beit HaMikdash, were actually done in the Beit HaMikdash. So you imagine every group of people bringing their Korban Pesach, parts of it were sacrificed on the altar. So the blood and whatever, we won't get into all the details because I don't want to freak out people in the morning. But once those things were given, the animal, what was left, which was the whole animal with no broken bones, the whole animal is now brought to people's personal spaces in Yerushalayim. So let's say, we decide, the Friedmans decide that together with the Epsteins, we're going to give the Korban together. So we rent an Airbnb, we rent a yard, because neither of us live in Jerusalem. And we say this Korban that we're offering is part of both families. And let's say we find out that Lucille's family doesn't have a place. So we say, hey, you can join on ours. And so we officially say this Korban is ours. We then bring the animal and sacrifice it. We roast it in our homes. Again, not on an altar. Parts go on the altar, but the actual mitzvah of Korban Pesach is done in the home. And that's, I can't tell you if it's completely unusual, because I do think that there were some shlamim, there were some peace offerings that were also sacrificed in this way, but definitely the rules in terms of sharing the Korban, designating the Korban, eating it in a private, roasting it and eating it in a private space were all done in private spaces. They were done in Jerusalem, but not in the Beit HaMikdash. And so this also allows us to have a bridge to our celebration today, because it already set the stage for something that was very personal, a Korban that was not completely offered on an altar, just like that Korban, the Korban Mitzrayim, just like that original Korban. So I wanted to kind of just give you a little bit of an understanding, a broad perspective on how highly unusual that moment in Mitzrayim was, and then how it led to a very particular way of celebrating and sacrificing the Korban Dorot, the Korban Pesach that happened after Mitzrayim. So for those of us who are familiar with kind of the way the rabbis interpret Torah, if I asked you, what was the first, many of you, what was the first mitzvah that was commanded to Bnei Israel once they are in the process of leaving Egypt, or Bnei Israel from any point in time? really the first mitzvah that is commanded to Am Yisrael, to the people of Israel. Just out of curiosity, what would you say? You could throw it into the chat if you want, or unmute yourself. What was the first mitzvah?
Rosh Chodesh.
Exactly. Who said it?
Judy.
Hey, thank you, Judy. Yashikov. So, right, the first mitzvah, and we make a whole meal of this, right? Like, it's very exciting. Like, the first moment in time, like, everybody can talk about it. Like, why is Rosh Chodesh such a significant mitzvah? Well, obviously, everything that happens in Judaism is very calendar related, from the most macro observance, like Sukkot, like Rosh Hashanah, like, holidays, to the most personal of rituals, like Nida, like, I can't think of other examples other than Nida, but you get the picture, like Shabbat, right? Like, counting days, being able to put it onto a calendar is essential for the ritual observance of Judaism. And what's very interesting about Rosh Chodesh, obviously, is that it's empowering the people to create that calendar, to create that it's saying that this is not a divine calendar, this is in the hands of the people to create. And then we can make a whole meal about the fact that, it's also such a transition from slavery, right? Because slaves have no control over their time. Slaves don't have the choice to say, I'm celebrating Shabbat now, I'm bringing a Korban Pesach. Slaves don't have those choices. And so by empowering people with the choice of time, then you are really essentially saying, this is the end of your slavery. You are now officially free. So that's all really beautiful. And that's an interesting concept. And I'm not here to completely overturn that. But if you look at the actual text of Shmot, what is actually the first mitzvah that is given to Bnei Israel? And it comes before Rosh Chodesh. And what is that mitzvah? What we're talking about now. They are told to bring a korban to God. So why don't we consider that to be the first mitzvah? Like, we continue to celebrate Pesach and to remember the Korban Pesach now and forever. So why don't we designate that first initial korban as the first mitzvah? And so one way to look at it, think about it for a second, because this is not the only way to look at it, but one way to look at it may be because that first mitzvah of giving the Korban Pesach was not what would eventually become the mitzvah of giving the Korban Pesach. So we know there are two sources for talking about Korban Pesach in the Torah. There are many sources, but two main sources. One comes up in Shmot and one comes up in Bamidbar. And they seem to be conflicting sources, because one source says you need to give a Korban Pesach, and one source says you will give the Korban Pesach when you get to Eretz Yisrael. You will give the Korban Pesach when you get to Eretz Yisrael. So what's the answer to that? Are we giving the Korban Pesach every year, or is it only something that we're going to do in Eretz Yisrael? And so that is one of the things that I want to look at today, but I'm going to put it aside. I hope that you continue to think about it, because I'm going to take us on a little bit of a different journey. But I do want to try to unravel what is going on with that first Korban Pesach, the Korban Mitzrayim, and what's going on with the Korban Dorot, and why wasn't that command to give the Korban Pesach considered to be the first mitzvah? Okay, so put that aside. Let's hope we don't forget it. And now I want to look at something that will hopefully help us in thinking about this perspective. So I want to start with this first source. This is from Pesachim, and this is where we get all the exciting, it is in Masechet Pesachim in the Talmud, where we get the structure for the Haggadah. Now, remember that the Mishnah, this is coming from the Mishnah is written when the Korban Pesach and when Pesach is still being celebrated in the Beit HaMikdash and in Jerusalem. Okay, so bear that in mind, because it means that the elements of the Haggadah were already in existence in the Mishnah, but then of course we had to make changes along the way. So here's the Mishnah. The previous Mishnayot talked about the idea of the 4 kosot definitely existed in the time of the Mishnah and probably before, because we see here we're talking about the second kos. So mazgulo kos sheni v'kan haben shoel aviv. They pour him they had at that time a lot of they had what they were called, I forgot what they were called, shamais, I think they were called, even though that's not the right word, but a lot of people had attendants, in their homes. So also, if you imagine they're in Jerusalem, and a lot of families would celebrate together and celebrate and join together on the Korban. So you would hire guys from the yeshiva and girls from Pelach to serve, like you do at bar mitzvahs. So you'd hire someone, okay, can you do the serving? So the servant, the person serving, would pour the kos sheni to whoever is leading the proceedings. And here they ask the children. The father will ask the children. V'im ein dat baben aviv melamdo. Here, if the child does not have da'at, and we know da'at has very significant meaning in halakha and rabbinic learning, it's not, we translate it as knowledge, but it really also means intention. If the son has no intention, like no kavanah, meaning no context and understanding, then the father teaches the son to the child to ask these questions. And here we go. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halaylot. Shebechol halaylot anu ochlin chametz umatzah. Halayla hazeh kulo matzah. Shebechol halaylot anu ochlin sha'ar yerakot. Halayla hazeh maror. Shebechol halaylot anu ochlin basar tzali shaluk umevushal. Halayla hazeh kulo tzali. Shebechol halaylot anu metablim pam achat. Halayla hazeh shtei pamim. And of course, all of you know that there's a glaring problem in these questions. There's one of them that we don't ever see. And people like to make, no pun intended, a whole meal out of this. But of course, you have to remember that this source is being written at the time of the Beit HaMikdash. And this, again, is pointing to the interesting aspect of this Korban Pesach, this shlamim, which the Pesach is a type of shlamim sacrifice, which is that after the parts of the Korban Pesach are sacrificed or given on the altar, the main part of the animal, the whole animal as a whole, is then brought to private residence and then roasted. And that's what the people eat. But it has to be roasted. It cannot be boiled, which sounds so gross. And it cannot be some other shalukas, some other kind of way that they would cook and boil and, stew kind of thing. It has to be eaten. It has to be roasted as a whole animal. And so the child asks, how come we can't have it boiled? How come we can't have it cooked in juice? How come it can't be covered in the oven in foil? Why is it being roasted outside? And so that's one of the questions, because it was an integral aspect of the Korban Pesach as it was celebrated in the Beit HaMikdash. So that was one of the questions. So we move on. Okay, so ulefi da'ato shel ben aviv melamdo. Again, based on the da'at, that special word da'at, it goes beyond knowledge, based on the comprehension, the ability, the potential, and the ability to contextualize of the child. That's how the father will answer. Okay, so here we are getting a very interesting concept, which is that the Haggadah, the way we see it today, it was much more fluid. The idea of it was much more fluid. All that we get from the Mishnah are guidelines of how the conversation should go. So we have questions, but those questions are really meant to be, if the child doesn't ask questions, then we teach the child to ask these questions. And by teaching the child to ask these questions, we're indicating to the child what is special about this celebration. And we also are giving indications to the parents on how to lead the discussion. Because one thing that we know, parents are parents. Parents are not teachers and they're not learners. They learn along the way how to be teachers and how to train learners, but they're not trained. Nobody gets a degree in parenting that comes along with a teaching degree. So this is really the Mishnah trying to say, these are the questions that you should be highlighting for your child. And this will also help you highlight what's important in the seder, what's important for this evening. So this is the guideline. You begin with gnut and you end with shevach. So what is gnut and what is shevach? So gnut here in the English here is translated, I think, very well. Disgrace, the low point, the absolute, where you can't get any lower, you can't even dig deeper. It's the bottommost part of someone's life. It's a very unusual word. Okay, so I just want to point that out, that at least I haven't really seen this word used very often. U'mesayem b'shevach, and you conclude with glory, with praise, with the height, with the apex. And how do you do it? How are you supposed to do that? How are you supposed to start the conversation by describing the low point and ending with the apex, ending with the glory? So the Mishnah tells us, you start with Arami Oved Avi, you start to expound on, you start to discuss, you start to darshan, Arami Oved Avi, Ad Shigmor Kol HaParsha Kula. Okay, until you finish the entire parsha.
Can you move the text up, please?
Yeah, do you see it? We're still here, by the way. Okay, so I want to just take a detour and look to see what parsha is the Mishnah talking about. And so we go to parsha. Can you see my screen now? It's Deuteronomy 26. Or do I have to stop sharing here? I know from experience that I actually have to stop sharing that again. And now we can do it. Okay, so now we're at Deuteronomy 26. Does everybody see this now? Okay, so famous beginning of Parshat Ki Tavo. It has, and let's just think about the fact that this is Devarim. This is Moshe talking to the next generation. This is not addressed to the slaves. The slaves have mostly died out. Moshe and a few more parshiot is going to die in Tezot HaBracha. And this is part of his explanation to this new generation of what they're going to do when they get to Eretz Yisrael. V'haya ki tavo el haaretz asher Hashem Elokecha noten lecha nachala v'yashafta bo. You're going to get to the land that God is giving to you as a nachala, as an inheritance, and you're going to possess it and you're going to settle it. V'lakachta mereshit kol pri adama asher tavi ma'artzecha asher Hashem Elokecha noten lach v'samta v'teneh v'halachta el hamakom asher yivchar Hashem Elokecha l'shaken shemo sham. You're going to take the first fruit, what we call today the bikurim, right? This is Shavuot. You're going to take the first fruits and you're going to bring it in a basket, like love those pictures of people dancing with the baskets and their fruits overflowing. You're going to take it with a basket and you're going to go to the place that God chooses to reside, meaning what we understand as the Mishkan, and then eventually the Beit HaMikdash. And in Jerusalem, but eventually, I think originally it was in Hebron, in Shiloh, and then whatever, eventually it gets to Jerusalem. Ubata ela kohen asher yeh b'yamim hahem. You're going to go to whoever is the kohen at the time. V'amarta elav higadati hayom laHashem Elokecha ki bati el haaretz asher nishpa Hashem lavotenu latet lanu. I acknowledge this day before your God, which is an interesting way of saying it because it's not the kohen's God, it's everyone's God. that I have entered the land that God swore to our fathers to give us. And so, V'lakacha kohena teneh miyadecha ve'anichu lifnei mizbach Hashem Elokecha. The Kohen takes the basket and puts it on the mizbeach. Ve'anita va'amarta lifnei Hashem Elokecha arami oved avi vayered mitzrayma ve'agar sham bimtei ma'at vayisham lagoy gadol atzum v'rav ve'ar'u otanu hamitzrim ve'anunu ve'itnu elenu avodah kasha. We all know this by heart. You shall recite the following statement. My father was a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt. He was few in number. He sojourned there. He got very populous. But then the Egyptians treated us really badly. And then God heard us. ויוצאנו השם ממצרים ביחזקה וזרוע נטויה במורא גדול באותות מופתים והביאנו אל המקום הזה וייתן לנו את הארץ הזאת ארץ זבת חלב ודבש. And the culmination after all of that, after all the Aseret HaDibrot, is we get to Eretz Yisrael. And now the continuation, you knew all of that by heart because you read it in the Haggadah every year, but now the continuation that we don't have in the Haggadah, ואתה הנה הבאתי את ראשית פרי האדמה אשר נתת לי השם והנחתו לפני השם אלוקיך והשתחווית לפני השם אלוקיך ושמחת בכל הטוב אשר נתן לך השם אלוקיך ולביתך אתה והלוי והגר אשר בקרבך. So what do we have here? We have basically a script, right? It's a script. And remember who Moshe is giving this script to. Moshe is giving this script to a young generation. They're a young generation that is about to enter Eretz Yisrael. And what's going to happen in Eretz Yisrael? They are going to become agriculturally tied people. Some of them are going to be shepherds, but most of them are going to be farmers. They're going to have fields. And unlike the desert, there's not going to be any man. There's not going to be an anan, there's not going to be an ish, there's not going to be this real guiding from God. They're going to be on their own. So what's important for them to remember, what the most important thing for them to remember is that everything that they have is actually a gift from God, including this Eretz. So the line that we always say, Eretz Avat Chalav Udvash, this land has resources. This land is overflowing with resources. Why is that so important? Because the land is a gift from God. The fact that it's overflowing with resources is not because of some special patent that you have for getting all this great fruit. It's because that's the land that God has given you. And so what's important for this generation to remember is that how easy it is to forget where the gift is coming from. This is a moment in time every year which we associate with Shavuot, every year when they are commanded to bring the Bikurim, that the first fruits are not theirs. The first fruits belong in the Beit HaMikdash. They're a Korban to God. But what's so unusual about this passage, what's so unusual about it is that it's a script, right? Which reminds you of what? It reminds you of our Haggadah, right? Because it's basically, it's a script. And it's a choreographed script, right? The Kohen, you bring your basket. The Kohen takes the basket. He lifts it up. He puts it on the mizbech, and then you say these lines. It's almost like saying a tefillah, but it's not a tefillah. It's very different than a scripted prayer. What's different about it? And think about who's giving it. What is so different about this script? So what's so different about this script is that it's already an acknowledgement that nobody from this group of people who's going into Eretz Yisrael actually experienced slavery. None of these people actually experienced this kind of gnut that the Talmud is referring to. They never experienced this kind of disgrace, this kind of servitude to someone else and not having freedom. So this is a script that's basically meant to say, this is our history. This is our this is the experience of your people that you cannot forget. And so again, just like we have a bridge to that first seder the first post-temple seder that we read about in Haggadah, we also have a very strong bridge with the experience of this first generation that's entering Eretz Yisrael. Many of us are also first generation having entered Eretz Yisrael, but we also have to acknowledge what is our fruit and what is a gift from really a gift from God. But the most important thing that we also are challenged with is making this story part of our personal story, even though we didn't experience it. We didn't actually have that experience, but we hold the DNA of that experience. And this is a passage that's coming to teach us this. So in acknowledging that, let's go back to the Gemara so that we can see where this takes us in understanding what is a disgrace and what is shevach, what is glory. Okay, so we see that according to the Mishnah, it's this passage from Arami Oved Avi. And so we explained Arami Oved Avi is probably the contextual understanding of Arami Oved Avi in the Haggadah, and you can talk about this for hours with your family. The Haggadah deliberately misinterprets what Arami Oved Avi is. Arami Oved Avi, as we see in Parshat Kitavo, is obviously talking about Avraham and talking about Yitzchak and talking about Yaakov. These were people who lived in the who lived in the Chaldeans. They lived in Mesopotamia, and Avraham brought them to Eretz Canaan, and he had been persecuted, and he started a nation that eventually went back to Egypt in the time of Yaakov and Yosef. So contextually speaking, we know, all of us here know what Arami Oved Avi is actually referring to. It's the beginning from Avraham to getting to Eretz Yisrael. That's the whole exposition. And everything that happened in between, namely slavery. But the Gemara, now we're in the Gemara, trying to understand when the Mishnah says we start with Gnut, we start with disgrace, and we end with Shevach, what is the Mishnah really trying to get at? So now we have a machloket. We have a very famous machloket between Rav and Shmuel. Now, Rav and Shmuel were the two leading thinkers of the 2nd and 3rd century in Babel. So they actually overlapped a little bit in time with Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who was in Eretz Yisrael. But they mainly lived at the same time as, let's say, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, who were in Eretz Yisrael. Rav, I believe Shmuel was the head of the yeshiva of Nahardea, and Rav was the head of the yeshiva of Sura. So they were like the contending leaders. And we're never going to get to them in our regular Matan class. So I'm just going to say one thing about them here, which is that we have lots of examples of, in Mishnah Perkei Avot, we hear about the Zugot, the original pairs of learners, who sometimes acted like Chavrutot, but really one was the head of the Sanhedrin and one was the vice head. We continue to see that in the Gemara. Like, we always hear about Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. We always hear about Abaye and Rava, and we always hear about Rav and Shmuel. So while they were both leaders of yeshivot that were not in proximity to each other, they clearly were in discussion and often in machloket about various issues. Another interesting thing to note here is Shmuel was a very interesting figure because he was also a doctor and a scientist and an astronomer. So he clearly was an unusual Amora in that he had obviously learning that went beyond Talmud learning. So Rav says, how do you do this? The question is, how do you start with Gnut? How do you start with disgrace? What's interesting is that the Gemara does not ask how you end with Shevach. Okay, so that's something, it just asks, how do you start with Gnut? So Rav says, you begin with Ovdei Avodah Zarah Hayu Avotenu. we begin with the fact that our forefathers worshipped idols. So who is he talking about? Presumably he's talking about Terach and Abraham, for a time. By the time you get to Yitzchak and Yaakov, they're not worshiping, they've already taken on the tradition of Abraham. And we don't see in the Torah any evidence that the slaves, that the Avadim were of Dei Avodah Zarah, but we don't know. And Shmuel says, what is the Gnut? Avadim Hayinu, that we were slaves. Okay, so note again, if I were to ask you, I'll ask you this now, but let's try to answer this when we get to it. If I would tell you, Rav says that the lowest point of our existence was when we were idolaters, what would be the high point? Then what would be the Shavach? And you guys, contribute. I would love to hear, what's the Shavach?
Beit HaMikdash, something with like
Har Sinai.
Beit Hashem.
Beit HaMikdash, good.
Har Sinai.
Har Sinai, excellent, right? Because if you're, or it could, there's no right answer to this. If you were idolaters, it seems like the culmination would be when you get the Torah, right? When you actually can say, I have a contractual relationship with one God, and I no longer, and in that contract, in the Aseret HaDibrot is the idea that, no more idolatry. But Beit HaMikdash is also a good answer because it also is the culmination that your rituals are going to be monotheistic, not pagan, not Avodah Zarah, and that's in the Beit HaMikdash. If you agree with Shmuel and you say Avadim Hayinu, having been slaves, what is the Shevach then? What's the Shevach to slavery?
Yitziat Mitzrayim.
Yitziat Mitzrayim, right? So you have two counterpoints. You have, Avodah Zarah with a culmination at Shavuot, and you have Avadim Hayinu with a culmination at Pesach, with Yitziat Mitzrayim. So who do we agree with? That we don't have, by the way, the Gemara then goes on to give another support to Shmuel, but I think it's to Shmuel, but it doesn't come to a conclusion. So what do we, like in our practice, who do we agree with?
I think we have
Well, the Shevach more has to do with us being in Israel.
Right.
So maybe we were more free once we got into Israel and we decided things for ourselves. Like you said, we didn't have the Anan, we didn't have the Man.
Very good.
We're more independent.
Very good.
Yeah,
So
I
that's
think it's
yes.
there's a synthesis between the two because we get the Zman Matan Torateinu, and the first of the Aseret HaDibrot emphasizes the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought us out of the land of Egypt, and therefore he is our God, that's our God. But also it's the first of the commandments. So it's the synthesis of the two.
Very good. Excellent. It's definitely so in our understanding, if we go back to our Mio Veravi, to that statement, I think that is a reflection of a synthesis. Also, if we go to the Haggadah, our Haggadah today tries to synthesize both of them. We just read it, and this is one of the things I hope that you get out of it, is that when we read the Haggadah, we often just take it for granted that this is the Haggadah without really thinking about the fact that the Haggadah has many, many layers of editors who are trying to synthesize different ideas that we want to talk about at the seder. And so the Haggadah that we have today, the traditional Haggadah that we have today, is indicating to us that we synthesize both, that like what Rachel said, that we acknowledge a gnut and a shavach that is surrounded by Eretz Yisrael and surrounded by true freedom and sovereignty, and that, like what Lucille said, that there's a spiritual gnut and shavach that is tied into an idea that Avodah Zarah is a disgrace. The idea that we were part of Avodah Zarah is a disgrace. And so the Haggadah tries to synthesize both those things. So it wasn't always the case that every Haggadah had both things, by the way, even though the Gemara says you really should have both those perspectives in your Haggadah, at least that seems to be, they don't ever weigh in as to who is correct, but it's not clear that every Haggadah or every seder, obviously everybody does what they want at a seder, would synthesize both. And that's why I want to come to Rambam here. You knew I would get there eventually. So I think it's worth reading Rambam, because Rambam just also tries to synthesize both, but there's an opinion that he sides with more. So again, let's remember the two perspectives. Rav says the worst thing that ever happened to us, our disgrace, is the fact that we were worshipers of Avodah Zarah, that we were not monotheists. So if anybody would take a guess, knowing Rambam, who does he side with more? Like, if philosophically speaking, what is the worst point in our life? What is the worst point in the Jewish existence? And that clearly for Rambam would be the fact that we were idolaters. So those of you in the Matan class, and those of you who have some experience with Rambam, he talks about he gives a kind of brief history of the Jews, where there's an idea that truth and wisdom and pure knowledge existed, but that over time it was forgotten, because people, when they lose their ability to actually understand the way the world works philosophically, theologically, scientifically, they lose their ability to access that truth. They started to substitute. They started to substitute what we would call idols. They started to substitute idols for the truth, that they no longer had a direct connection to understanding and knowledge of the truth. And of course, who was Rambam's hero in this respect? We talked about this in Matan. Who was Rambam's hero? Who did he think of as the ultimate philosopher who understood truth? Anybody?
Moshe, right?
Moshe is a hero, but it's not Moshe.
You mean a non-Jewish man?
Abraham. Very good. Sorry, yeah. We're going to go into that weird rabbit hole. Abraham is the hero of Rambam. And so why is Abraham the hero of Rambam? Why is he, remember, he calls him the Eitan Hagadol, this great hero. And he doesn't call Moshe the Eitan. Obviously, rabbinically speaking, Abraham and Eitan were associated. But why is Abraham the hero? Why is Abraham the hero?
Because he's an iconoclast, like he's willing to fight and time.
Sorry, Kalanit, I couldn't understand anything you said. Can you speak clearer?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
I was saying because maybe I'm just taking a guess, because he's an iconoclast. He's defying what is going on at the time and his surroundings in order to find like a greater truth.
That's exactly right. So we have a midrash about Rambam that talks about about Abraham, not Rambam, I'm sure. We have a midrash about Abraham, where Abraham's father sells idols. It's not just that they're idol worshipers, they're purveyors of idol worshipers, right? Like, it's one thing to passively go to Rami Levi and buy an idol, but when you're actually Rami Levi and selling the idols, that's like the ultimate idolater, right? But then we have this midrash where Abraham, he's left alone with the store. Terach goes out to buy more idols, and Avraham all of a sudden has this epiphany. According to the midrash, he has this understanding that he looks at the stars and he looks at the sun and he looks at the moon, and he comes to understanding all of these things are not gods in themselves. All of these things are being controlled by a prime mover. There's some sort of force, divine force that is not bifurcated. It's not multiple, it's one, it's monotheistic. And so he is the first monotheist, but he's the hero. Like Kalanit said, he was the iconoclast. He was able to go based on first principles to his understanding. And this is so important to Rambam, because Judaism needs to be based on a religion, a rational religion, that while we inherit it, our parents teach it to us, our teachers teach it to us, we embrace it, but there's also a rational side where, had we grown up in Mesopotamia amongst these idol worshipers, we too could have the potential to dig our way out and to understand truth, just like Abraham. Moshe is also a hero as a leader, but we learned in the Matan class, by the time we get to the slaves, by the time we get to the Abadim, we're dealing with a very different intellectual type of group that don't have the ability to be Abraham. So we're going to think about that as well. So let's look at the Mishnah Torah. That's the quote from the Gemara. You begin with the disgrace and you end with the glory. Ketzad, how do you do that? Matchil u'misaper shebatchila hayu avotenu b'yamei terach u'melefanav kofrim v'to'in achar ha'hevel v'rodfin achar avodat elilim. You start to talk about, and this is very painful, you start to talk about that our fathers, like the people that we respected in the days of Terach, they umlefanav, and before him, kofrim, they were kofrim. They completely diverted from the path. Now, is this the path of Torah? No, the Torah didn't exist at that point. They diverted from the path of truth. And Rambam again is acknowledging truth existed. There was truth that was there. They just didn't see it. They were like in Plato's cave. They were completely bamboozled by the life, by the idolatrous life that was before them. The To'in, they went off, like we call in the, mistaken, they went off that path. Achar ha-hevel, this is an important term in Rambam. Hevel is the opposite of truth. Hevel is nothing to Rambam. Hevel is, we translate it sometimes as vanity. It's nothingness. There's truth, which is solid and meaningful, and Hevel, it's nothing. And we today can talk about it in terms of materialism, right? It's Hevel. There's no value to it. There's no erech to it. And how did they do that? They ran. They didn't just walk. They ran after this idolatry. But what's the Shavach then? Umesayem b'dat ha'emet shekarvanu hamakom lo v'hivdilanu mehaumot v'karvanu liyechudo. What's the apex for Rambam? The apex is dat ha'emet, true knowledge of religion, true knowledge of Judaism, meaning there's the Judaism that you learn and there's the Judaism that you acquire, the rational Judaism. Shekarvanu hamakom lo. Instead of us giving a korban to God, God brought us close to him. That word karev, I don't think is a mistake there. I think it is associated with Korban Pesach. God brought us close to him. V'hevdilanu mehaumot v'karbanu liyichudo. And he separated us, he distinguished us from the nations and brought us close, not to him, but to his unity, the unity of God, to the monotheistic notion of God, to Shema Yisrael. That is the apex. The apex is that we come halfway and God brings us the other halfway. So we come to understanding intellectually and philosophically the idea of truth, and then God distinguishes us and brings us even closer to that truth, to that monotheistic truth. Now, let's unpack this for a second. So for Rambam, the Gnut is obvious, right? The Gnut is the time of Terach and before. What's the Shevach? What's the Shevach for Rambam then? So I would say that the Shevach is Abraham. The Shevach is the point at which someone understands the truth, that someone comes to that truth and is able to partner with God in bringing people closer. Now, Avraham wasn't altogether successful with it. And, that's why you need another figure with Moshe. But please note that it is possible to have Shevach in Mitzrayim. There could have, we don't know it, but there could have been slaves in Mitzrayim who understood this truth and that were understanding of monotheism even as a slave. So that while your physical reality may be that you're not free and that you can't celebrate Rosh Chodesh and you can't bring a Korban Pesach, while that may be your reality, it doesn't mean that you're not Jewish. It doesn't mean that you haven't come to truth and understanding monotheism and understanding the unity of God. So I think that that's a really, that's a very Maimonidean way of looking at this. It kind of pulls it on it turns it on its head a bit. So he then agrees also with Shmuel, and he believes in his Haggadah. Rambam has a Haggadah in the Mishnah Torah. He combines both. He synthesizes both. But I want to underscore the primacy of Rav's opinion for Shmuel. Now, I mentioned before, and we'll finish with this. I mentioned before that word gnut is really unusual. And the way we started this shiur was to look at what was the essence of the Korban Pesach, and what was that first Korban? Why wasn't that considered the Korban Mitzrayim? Why wasn't that considered to be the first mitzvah given to the people? And we do know here in Bamidbar that the Jews again were commanded to give a Korban Pesach. So here, let's read quickly in Bamidbar. Vaydaber Hashem Moshe Bamidbar Sinai b'shana hashenit letzetam me'eretz Mitzrayim b'chodesh harishon lemor. So they've left Midbar Sinai, and this is on the second year after they left Egypt, in the Chodesh Harishon, which we know as Nisan, not Tishrei. Ve'asu b'nei Yisrael et ha'pasach b'moado. Tell the people to bring a Korban Pesach at its right time. And we actually don't go into huge amount of details here. There's an understanding that they already know how to give it because they just gave it the last year in Mitzrayim. But here it says you're going to give it at Ben Hashmashot, you're going to give it at twilight. That's another unusual thing about Korban Pesach. We're not going to get into it here. On the 14th day, and Moshe tells the Bnei Israel to do this. Now, we don't have, I think now we're going to get to the answer of why we don't consider the Korban Pesach of Mitzrayim to be the first mitzvah and why it's Rosh Chodesh. The Korban Mitzrayim, that was the Korban Pesach that we call Korban Mitzrayim, that was commanded right before they left Egypt, was not meant to be. It was a one-time occurrence. And here we have God telling Moshe to tell Bnei Israel again how to do the Korban Pesach. Meaning what? Meaning that first Korban, it was understood that was not meant to be the way this was going to be celebrated for the generations. That was a one-time occurrence. It was a one-time Korban. It was the first time that as slaves, they were sacrificing something to God, and it was not going to be repeated ever in that same way. So that when they're in the desert in their second year, or the beginning of their second year, when they're in the desert, Moshe commands it again. But again, Moshe doesn't tell them, you're going to do this every year. Moshe just says, you give a Korban Pesach. And we know historically, at least historically based on the Torah, that Bnei Israel in the desert do not give another Korban. They do not give another Korban Pesach. And we know this if we look at the Haftorah for the first day of Pesach. The Haftorah for the first day comes from Yoshua. And what happens in Parak Hay, the fifth parak of Yoshua? Yoshua circumcises everybody. They've just crossed Ever HaYarden. Joshua brings everybody into Eretz Yisrael, and yay, you're here. Everybody gets to get circumcised. And what's the first thing they do? They give a Korban Pesach. And so we understand that something happened along the way in the Midbar. Something happened. There are many explanations for why Bnei Israel did not continue to give a Korban Pesach. One explanation we have in Yoshua, which is why they weren't circumcised. And we know from the rules of Korban Pesach, you have to be circumcised to give it. Why weren't they circumcised? I don't know, desert living, maybe there was a practicality, you don't want to start, circumcising everyone. Maybe they didn't deserve to be circumcised. And right after this Korban Pesach, the one-time Korban Pesach given in the desert happens, we have, chronologically speaking, right after that is the Meraglim, is the story of the spies. And so that can also explain why that generation was not allowed to give a Korban Pesach. They did it once, then we have the Meraglim. When they did it that one time, there was probably an understanding, okay, we're going to get into Eretz Yisrael and we're going to do the Korban Pesach there. But that never happens because they get sidetracked by the Meraglim and they start to go on this path, wandering aimlessly for 40 years until they all die, and none of that generation gets into Eretz Yisrael. So I want to look at Rashi for a second that tries to explain it. B'chodesh harishon parasha shebarosh hasefer lo ne'emra ad iyar lamadata she'ein seder mukdam u'muachar b'torah v'lama lo patach b'zo. So he's pointing out that this parsha that talks about the Korban Pesach in the desert actually is happening chronologically. It's happening in Iyar, not in Nisan. And he's trying to understand why the Meraglim why the Meraglim is mentioned before the Korban Pesach and all of that. And this is one of the famous places where Rashi says there is no historical there's no linear historical. You do not depend on the Torah to give you a linear historical travel log of the Jews in the desert. There's no chronology. It's not a history book. So why didn't it open the parsha with this story? Mipnei shehi gnutan shel Yisrael. And that is the point I want to bring us back to, that word of gnut. Rashi, who knew the word gnut very well, Rashi understands this gnut and says, actually, this is the disgrace of Eretz Yisrael. This is the point of their disgrace. Shekol 40 shana shahayu Yisrael b'midbar lo hikrivu ela pesach zo bilvad. For all the 40 years that they were in the desert, they only gave one Pesach sacrifice. One Pesach sacrifice. And so now we can include Rashi in that original machloket with Rav and Shmuel. Rav says the point, the gnut is avodah, that we were idolaters. Shmuel says the gnut was that we were slaves. And Rashi says it's even worse than that. It's worse than that because these were a liberated people who could not have the faith to enter into Eretz Yisrael. They could not, they were not idolaters. They were not slaves. They didn't have the faith to take that step into Eretz Yisrael. They believed the Meraglim, and the Meraglim didn't have to convince them very well because they already were predisposed not to be able to make that leap into Eretz Yisrael. So I would say to us today, we have the Shevach in our hands. We're here. We obviously didn't have the circumstances that the slaves had, but I think that all of us celebrating Pesach in Eretz Yisrael today have the Shevach, have the glory of being able to celebrate it in the place where it's supposed to be celebrated. Don't everybody go to Yerushalayim now, but you can do it in Zichron as well. So thank you, everybody. If anybody has any questions, I can stay on for a couple of minutes, but thank you for coming for this shiur. And I hope I gave you some ideas to think about for the Seder.